may not be familiar, is a coalition of members representing various socialist groups from across so-called Vancouver. The assembly is open to all who self-identify as socialist and was created as a means for our otherwise siloed socialist groups to connect, share information and actions, and collaborate on common goals. This webcast is the product of one such collaboration, and I'm very excited to be a part of the production. Before I introduce the speakers, I would like to recognize that we are gathered on the unceded and stolen territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Depending on where you're joining us from, you may be on other ancestral lands, and I would absolutely encourage you to be familiar with the peoples whose lands you're occupying as you participate in this event. So for tonight, each of our three speakers is an activist who has been involved in the organizing effort around their respective topics. These folks have real on-the-ground organizing experience and campaigns and efforts around these issues, and so their perspectives are incredibly valuable, especially to those of us looking to get involved in the fight. Karina Castro is a Nicaraguan and Chilean-born non-binary person who moved from Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory to so-called Vancouver 3 years ago. They joined Red Braid Alliance for Decolonial Socialism 2 years ago and are currently focused on housing struggles in the downtown East Side, including acting as Red Braid representative within the Our Homes Can't Wait, so OHCW coalition. They have also been involved in organizing at the Tent City in Strathcona Park, and they will be speaking on the topic of housing and houselessness, analyzing actions by all three levels of colonial government. Our next speaker is Robbie Mahood, and he is a lifelong socialist who grew up in Saskatchewan and witnessed the 1962 battle for Medicare. He is a semi-retired family doctor working in Montreal and is also a member of the Ligne pour l'Action Socialiste. He will be speaking on the COVID-19 pandemic and related issues of corporate profiteering. Our final speaker, Taz Kanwani, is an activist and an organizer, carrying out most of his work on the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Taz believes that it is imperative for socialists and anti-capitalists to recognize that true liberation on Turtle Island relies on understanding what it means to work in solidarity with Indigenous communities struggling against settler colonialism and land back. While in our shared struggle against capitalism, Taz believes that it is important that we frame carceral institutions as the appendages of the colonial state that they are, and that coercive and oppressive policies that rule these institutions exist to protect private property, state, and capitalist interests. Hence, socialists must work towards the abolition of the carceral state. So he will be speaking on the topic of defunding the police. Before I relinquish the mic to our first speaker, I will explain a little about how audience participation in this webcast is going to work. So as speakers are giving their presentations, you will be able to submit questions and comments in the chat. Make sure you include the name of the person who you are directing your question or comment at. I will be keeping a running list of all of the questions asked to each speaker and questions which are open to all speakers. So if you have a question that you're asking of everybody, just say question to all. After the presentations are complete, so after we've heard from all three speakers, I will direct questions to each speaker in sets of 3 or 4. And the question and answer component of this night will take us to around 8:30, so probably around 40 minutes, or until all questions have been asked. So that's it for the housekeeping. Thank you guys for listening. And without further ado, let's hear from our first speaker, Karina Castro.
Thanks a lot, Yvonne. I'm also calling in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Thank you for acknowledging the territories. I'm part of an organization called Red Braid Alliance, which has its roots in a group called the Social Housing Alliance from around 2012. Over the years, we went from pushing for reforms around social housing towards a focus on building up the independent power of poor Indigenous people and poor working class people. We aim to politicize people's daily survival struggles towards revolutionary possibilities rather than seeking inclusion into bourgeois colonial society. I joined 2 years ago and last year began organizing in the downtown East Side. As a Tent City organizer, I focus on supporting resident self-organization to fight for adequate permanent housing. I'm also a Red Braid representative in the Our Homes Can't Wait coalition to support the development of this group as an institution that's independent from the state and that is built for and by low-income residents, a space where downtown Eastside residents can organize without the risk of displacement, as would be the case in other sites like Tent City. So here's the bulk of my presentation. In response to the growing homeless crisis, Canada's National Homelessness Strategy pretends to follow a housing-first approach. However, in the absence of enough social housing for everyone, cities use a police-first approach to harass, assault, and bully unhoused people out of public spaces. In addition, different levels of government in various cities in the USA and Canada are experimenting with government-regulated tent cities. The purpose of emerging government policies around tent cities is to develop greater coordination between hard power and soft power to neutralize and break up the struggle of unhoused people in these tent cities. Between January and April 30th, the city and the Vancouver Parks Board worked with the province to regulate the Strathcona camp, gradually shrinking the camp's physical size and population until the city and the Parks Board shut it down. This intergovernmental coordination is just the tip of the iceberg, though. Also involved in this coordination are those state forces that operate through claims of benevolence, including but not limited to Carnegie Outreach, housing agencies like Portland Hotel Society, and even forces inside the structure of the camp who marginalize radical voices that critique the regulation and management of unhoused people as the solution to housing, or rather the housing crisis. There was a split in the political forces that were supporting the tent city. On one hand, there were those who understand tent cities as a space of resistance and potential power against homelessness, and those, on the other hand, who see tent cities as sites to be managed in order to alleviate the worst aspects of homelessness. The regulation of Strathcona Camp before the city shut it down was possible because the forces of soft power who support the management of low-income spaces as a pragmatic approach to addressing the housing crisis won, rather than the forces who were antagonistic to the state. Unregulated tent cities are perceived as dangerous to the propertied public because they're sites where informal and criminalized economies are organized. Since the birth of Strathcona Tent City, residents and Indigenous leadership have been on the receiving end of endless smears from media, property owners, and small business owners. For nearly a year, homeowners organized in the Strathcona Residents Association cried out for police and government to scatter the tent city, relying on the narrative that camp is a fountainhead of violence and criminality and is a danger to their personal property, their high property values, and their families. The City and Parks Board bowed to the public's anti-port backlash by waging an escalating attack against the tent city over the past several months. Mayor Kennedy Stewart and City Council planned how to squash the tent city and its threat to private property by tasking city staff with providing preliminary cost assessments of various approaches to destroy Strathcona Camp. Establishing sanctioned encampments was one of the possibilities, alongside purchasing or leasing hotels, SROs, and establishing a tiny home village. Mayor Kennedy Stewart and city councilors voted to dismantle the camp by placing people into emergency hotels and shelters and SROs. Although the city did not vote in favor of establishing a new sanctioned camp to evict Strathcona residents into, they used the sanctioned camps experiment in order to regulate the camp until they could shut it down. The city worked with the Parks Board, province, feds, pro-reform camp supporters, social workers, and police to do so. This method of regulation was also used in Nanaimo to take down Discontent City in 2018 and Anita Place Tent City in Maple Ridge in 2019. The Parks Board worked with the city to constrict the camp's capacity to grow and did this by installing some fencing along the eastern portion of the park in January. In February, the Parks Board General Manager Donnie Rosa issued an order to clear Tent City residents from the west side of the park and enforce the fence perimeter around the eastern portion of the Tent City. Then, on April 9th, Rosa issued another order to clear the remaining Tent City residents from the eastern portion of camp by April 30th to shut down Strathcona Camp for good. Parallel to the physical enclosure of the tent city, the city worked in partnership with service providers to send in outreach workers. In exchange for some needed health services like funding for an overdose prevention site, outreach workers were able to map out existing relationships in the space, build relationships with camp residents, identify what their individual mental and physical needs are, and place individual camp residents on waiting lists to live in other state-regulated congregate sites, including supportive housing, hotels, and community centers. Social workers and outreach workers are an essential aspect of regulating the poor. They are fundamental in disorganizing existing encampments because each individual must then negotiate with the outreach worker for what they need. Forces at camp were focused on cooperation rather than antagonism with state forces. Alongside the physical layout of the space made it difficult for us to support residents to mount and organize resistance to the presence of social workers. And without that collective voice demanding adequate housing for everyone, social workers could come in and fragment the power of the camp by isolating residents from each other and scattering them into indoor spaces, or if residents refuse these units, back onto more dangerous homelessness on the streets. This intergovernmental coordinated displacement of Strathcona Tent City was the result of months of planning at the highest levels of government in consultation and cooperation with legal reform groups, social service agencies like Portland Hotel Society, and advocacy groups like Homeless Services Organization of BC. In BC, the province, the City of Vancouver, and the Vancouver Parks Board and the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation signed a memorandum in early April, which formalized their partnership to end Strathcona Park and also help prevent encampments from forming in the future. As part of this MOU, the province is responsible for funding shelters and supportive housing that people living in camps will be offered. Even if a resident refuses the unit or the shelter space because it doesn't suit their needs, however, the city then is still able to say that they offered housing and can then go in and evict residents from the park or wherever they're staying. For the city, the MOU outlines that the city and the Parks Board are responsible for enforcing bylaws around when and where unhoused people can camp. If there are designated areas where an unhoused person can be, then city workers and cops have the power to corral unhoused people into those sanctioned areas. And those who aren't in those sanctioned areas will face greater harassment or criminalization at the hands of city workers. An example of pressure from nonprofit organizations in the province to develop provincial guidelines around dealing with encampments is the Homeless Services Association of BC. They published guidelines last summer in which they framed government-funded, peer-run tent cities as a pragmatic approach to homelessness until homes are built. In cases where the province does not secure new buildings to house people in, sanctioned camps will act as outdoor shelters, which, as a consequence, reduces the pressure off the government to even build indoor shelters. As decolonial socialists, we organize in tent city struggles because whereas the state blames homelessness on unhoused people, our understanding is that homelessness is an outcome of and a necessary condition for imperialism and settler colonialism. On one hand, homelessness is ongoing colonial violence for Indigenous people, where Canada forces Indigenous people into an ongoing cycle of displacement and attempts to continue severing their ties with family and children. On the other hand, homelessness is a form of discipline for working class people. It punishes them when they are no longer useful to their bosses and landlords, and dangles homelessness as a threat in front of the eyes of working class people who are still housed or employed to not be like those other people. In both processes, homelessness is in the interest of private property and accumulating profit. As spaces of homeless people's resistant self-activity, governments and property owners invent danger to displace unregulated tent cities because they are sites where informal and criminalized economies are organized. Social workers and reformers attempt to try and smother the self-activity of Indigenous peoples and working class people because their interests are fundamentally in opposition to private property and profit making. We fight against the regulation of camps by middle-class regulators and seek to increase the danger that camps pose to property. As decolonial socialists, we see the emancipation of oppressed people as only possible through their self-activity. So we organize in tent cities not to save unhoused people or bear moral witness to the brutality that's done to them, but to support their political self-activity and to collaborate together as a bloc that's counter to the intergovernmental social worker and legal and political reformer bloc that conspires against them. Ours is a bloc of working class unity and for Indigenous sovereignty. We fight for universal housing. We fight to wrench housing out of the market for all Indigenous people and working class people, no matter what their citizenship status is, so that everyone has somewhere safe, secure, and dignified to live. We also fight to abolish all anti-poor bylaws and policies which the municipal government uses to enforce when and where unhoused people can and cannot be. Fighting for the self-organization of poor, Indigenous, and working class people against heightening government regulation is to put power behind the logic that people are worth more than profit. At Strathcona Camp, a balance of forces existed between the flexible, adaptive bloc of state power and radical voices and militants. The truth is that the state bloc won the battle at Strathcona Camp by using violent hard power and soft power in a coordinated way. However, our lessons at Strathcona Camp help us know who our alliances are with so that we can increase the self-organization of unhoused low-income people before the next battle. The seeds of Indigenous sovereignty and class struggle sprout and multiply from the cracks of the settler colonial state. The government may have officially shut down Strathcona Tent City, but the state will never sweep the resistance of those at the losing end of the housing crisis under the rug.
That was excellent and great words to end on. Thank you, Karina. I especially, I thought it was interesting how you went through all of the different ways that these settler states are trying to corral and basically hide the problem rather than helping to provide solutions. So yeah, that was very interesting. And just a reminder to everybody that if you have questions for Karina, you can put them in the chat and I will read them out at the end of the presentations. So our next presenter is Robbie Mahood, and he will be speaking on the topic of the COVID-19 pandemic and corporate profiteering. Robbie, when you're ready. Oh, it looks like Robbie is muted. Joe, do you have a solution for that?
You should be able to unmute himself.
I am, yes, I'm capable, just barely. Yeah, first off, just wanted to say that I'm speaking to you from the territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is the island of Montreal, which includes a number of Indigenous peoples historically. Well, that was a very interesting talk, and it reminded me of the very tragic death of a homeless man this winter in Montreal, Raphael Andre, who was well known in the homeless community, who was expelled from a shelter and died of exposure during the curfew. So he was really a tragic reminder of not only the plight of the homeless, but the whole housing crisis in Montreal. Okay, so let me try to get through as much of this as I can. I hope it won't be too lengthy. And so here goes. So under capitalism, war and so-called natural disasters have always created, which we're living through, one of which, have always created the opportunity of windfall profits for some sectors of capital. And this pandemic is no exception. 17 of the top 25 most profitable US corporations brought in an extra $85 billion in 2020, and 2021 will bring an even bigger bonanza. We're talking about Visa, Microsoft, Pfizer, Intel, Facebook, Apple, Merck, Johnson & Johnson, and Google. They lead the pack of profiteers. As one can see, besides the pharmaceutical industry, the pandemic has also hugely benefited high tech and the online retailing giants such as Amazon. In fact, Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos himself saw his personal wealth increased by 65 billion, while his workers face speed up and elimination of their hazard pay. I'm going to devote most of my remarks to the pandemic profiteering by the pharmaceutical industry because it's the one I'm most familiar with. So in the years before the appearance of COVID-2 or COVID-19, Big Pharma signally failed to develop a coronavirus prototype, even though there had been several epidemics involving close cousins of COVID-19. I'm speaking about the SARS-CoV-1 outbreak in 2003 and the Middle East respiratory syndrome epidemic of 2012. Scientists predicted that a larger global pandemic would sooner or later take place, and they proved to be right. In a business driven by profit, vaccines have a problem. They're not very profitable, at least not without government subsidies. Pharma companies favor expensive medicines that must be taken repeatedly and generate revenue for years or decades. Vaccines are often given only once or twice. In many parts of the world, established vaccines cost a few dollars per dose or less. And as we know, Pfizer was charging something in the order of $31 or $32 per dose. Only when the COVID-19 contagion accelerated and there was a prospect of huge profits guaranteed by governments did the pharmaceutical companies gear up, relying in large measure on the publicly funded research that had been done on the coronavirus family. The $10 billion gift that Trump gave the pharmaceutical industry changed Big Pharma's perspective on vaccines. Not only the industry as a whole, but drug company executives profited handsomely. On the same day that Pfizer announced that its COVID vaccine trial was successful, its CEO, Albert Bourla, raked in 5.6 million from selling Pfizer stock when its price bounced on the news. Pfizer, Moderna, and other companies refused to supply poorer countries with their vaccines and were able to forestall even a temporary waiving of their vaccine patents until this month, while the infection ran rampant through India, Brazil, and other countries that had the capacity for rapid production of vaccines at low cost if the patents were waived. AstraZeneca, the UK vaccine consortium, promised at least for a limited time to deliver their vaccine at no cost to poorer countries. They were reportedly dissuaded from this affront to market principles by none other than Bill Gates. So much for liberal capitalist philanthropy. So the true story reveals a very checkered record and significantly qualifies the accolades bestowed on the pharmaceutical industry for its rapid development of a vaccine against COVID-19 in early 2020. Since the onset of the pandemic, global concentration of wealth has risen to truly obscene levels, beyond even what it had become over the last few decades. The top 1% of the US population has 53% of financial assets, while the top 10% have 87%. The world's billionaire class, now numbering some 2,500 individuals, has increased its wealth by over $4 trillion, of which 1.3 trillion was garnered by US billionaires. The vast majority of pandemic mega profits are distributed to shareholders, mainly already wealthy white males, through buybacks and dividends. The result is deepening class, gender, and racial inequality. How does the existing left, broadly defined, address the features of global capitalism which have been revealed by the pandemic? And that includes the pandemic profiteering, as well as a public health failure at a global level and a scandalous level of inequality. Well, one demand that is acutely posed by the pandemic is we have to abolish intellectual property rights, whether in the pharmaceutical or any other domain. Scientific and technical knowledge should be the common property of humankind and no longer used for the profit of the few. That's a very important battle, and the pandemic has really brought out its significance. Another demand that has come to the fore is tax the pandemic profiteers. emanating from the Sanders wing of the US Democratic Party and various liberal and progressive think tanks or NGOs. Oxfam USA, for example, proposes a COVID-19 pandemic profits tax. In a major analysis of runaway corporate profits published in July last year, they put the case for resurrecting the wartime emergency tax on excess profits, targeting the top 25 US companies. The $80 billion and probably much more that would be raised would then be reinvested in addressing COVID-19 inequities, both in the United States and globally. So-called routine profits, however, would not be targeted, only those in excess of the previous 4-year average, and the tax would be temporary for the duration of the pandemic or the economic crisis, possibly for the next 5 years. Oxfam clearly subscribes to the post-pandemic rebuild better mantra. In fact, they explicitly refer to this. They demand that all companies pay their fair share of taxes, stop shifting profits to low tax jurisdictions, and act more transparently. In this way, restoring public confidence in the tax system. Similarly, Brock University Professor of Educational Studies, Trevor Norris, called in March 2021 for a tax on pandemic profiteering by big tech companies to help fund public education. Well, these proposals, it seems to me, spring from a redistributive perspective. A certain degree of fairness and equity, or the need for a certain degree of fairness and equity is acknowledged, yes, but not so far as to undermine the profit system. The goal is to restore credibility to the tax system, in this way buying a certain measure of class peace, I suggest, in order to preserve the system. This is classic reformism. If these proposals for tax fairness were beefed up, they would certainly deserve critical support. But what is really required is a far-reaching and radically redistributive overhaul of the tax system. There's certainly some sympathy for this at the base of the NDP and the labor movement in this country, but no political force in Canada, including the present NDP and CLC leaderships, is willing to wage a battle for such a reform. Still less is there any hope of such a vigorous campaign in the US, Bernie Sanders notwithstanding. We should take, in my opinion, a lesson from Marx, who sought to break from the moralism of the utopian socialists of his day and place socialism on a more scientific basis. Profiteering is not fundamentally a problem of corporate greed. Rather, it's certainly greed exists, but it's not fundamentally a problem of corporate greed. Rather, it springs from the profit imperative of the system as a whole, which capitalists ignore at their peril. Profit is the raison d'etre of the capitalist system. Companies, whether large or small, live or die by amassing profits, and they are driven by the whip of competition into a never-ending race for market share, which will otherwise fall to their competitors. In that sense, profiteering is a normal function of the system. It follows that a purely redistributive approach is bound to fall short, since it does not challenge the fundamental dynamics of capitalism. As Michael Roberts argues, because inequality of wealth stems from the concentration of the means of production and finance in the hands of a few, and because that ownership structure remains untouched, any increased taxes on wealth will fall short of irreversibly changing the distribution of wealth and income in modern societies. In other words, whatever might be gained in terms of a fairer distribution of wealth in the short term will be eroded as long as the reign of capital prevails. Instead, we must put forward the slogan periodically advanced in the labor movement since Marx's time, and that is, expropriate the expropriators. That would mean that we not stop at taxing the profiteers, but that we eliminate their capacity to generate profits in the first place by bringing their property and their operations into the public domain, that is, by socializing them under workers and community control. Besides the oil and gas industry, there is arguably no better candidate, in my opinion, for expropriation and public ownership than the pharmaceutical industry. although some may argue that there are other contenders. Marx argued that as living labor was the source of surplus value, its replacement over time by machines under the whip of competition would tend to drive the rate of profit down for the system as a whole. I think we are witnessing a tendency of the rate of profit to fall in the current epoch. And this is at the heart of capitalism's inherent economic instability, throwing societies into periodic crises for which there is ultimately no exit other than replacing the capitalist system by an international socialist order. The declining rate of profit gives the capitalist class less room for concessions, which in any case it is reluctant to grant, unless forced to by an insurgent working class in society. Capital depends on labor. It also fears social upheaval and further erosion of its base of support, hence the decision of its political representatives to provide income support during the current crisis. However, the search to restore profitability in a world of competing capitalist states requires these same bourgeois forces to try to double down on the class war from above, austerity at home and imperialism abroad. There is no appetite in the parliamentary arena today for deep-going tax or any other major reform. Should agitation in the streets, in workplaces and communities reach critical dimensions, the movement is likely to bypass tepid reform proposals such as temporarily taxing excess profits in favor of more radical transitional demands that would include the nationalization of key industries, underworkers, and community control. Along the way, a key task will be to replace the bureaucratic leaderships of the NDP and the unions, whose role is to sacrifice the mass movement in order to save the system to which they are loyal. To be sure, a new leadership of the working class and oppressed is only at an embryonic stage, but confidence in the system and its political guardians is at an all-time low and shows no signs of a revival. So I'll stop there and we'll move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Robbie. That was very informative, and I especially like the background that you gave at the beginning. Thank you very much. And just a reminder to everybody that you can put questions in the chat. I see that it is being populated with a few questions already, so you can continue to do that as we hear from our third speaker. Oh, no worries. That is Taz, and he's going to be speaking on the topic of defunding the police. Taz, when you're ready.
I'm ready. Hi, folks. Name's Taz. I'm joining you as well from the ancestral and traditional lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So I guess the question I was asked to answer in a sense was, what is the Vancouver defund movement all about? It's a big question, as you can imagine. There's a lot of things that have been happening, but I think ultimately the thing as socialists should be working towards is abolition of these carceral institutions. But I'll tell you this: there's a lot of stuff happening in Vancouver around defunding, but most importantly, the work to make police obsolete, prisons obsolete, requires community engagement, but more importantly, it requires dual power. And the people that are building that power for their own communities are folks with lived experiences, of course, right? So these are the unhoused people. These are sex workers. These are people who use drugs. These are racialized communities, essentially anyone and everyone that has historically been targeted by policing and continues to be targeted by policing and faces that form of institutional oppression through many intersections of their own lives. So they're engaging in providing safe supply for each other. They're engaging in creating directories of bad dates. They're doing the work that is necessary to move to a future that does not require coercion and oppressive modes of operating. In any case, one of the things that I really want to ground for us is that prisons and policing are part of and integral to upholding the colonial and capitalist superstructures, right? Which is our liberal democracy. We know that the cops are a tool of the state, to protect its interests and goals. We also know that the state relies on its legitimacy to attract capital and to extract labor and resources without being hindered. And it is in fact another job of the cops to protect that interest, right? And that of capital. So the rule of law is real. It really works in favor of the state and the people with money, and a real pain in the ass for racialized communities, So whether you're a Supreme Court judge like Judge Romilly, or who was just arrested very recently by the VPD, anyways, or someone who is in need of help, and support, but instead is faced by police violence and often killed, like Chester in the downtown east side, and Zhao Din, whose family, has been fighting for justice for some time. And the cops that killed Zhao Din are, let off. And it's not the only story there. There's many like those. So what's happening in Vancouver? We've got some motions at the city level. There's people organizing on their own. There's a lot of concerted efforts between groups. We are doing everything we can to support each other. But ultimately, the work that needs to happen is taking place on the ground in the communities. So what is our job? Our job as socialists is to support their work, right? So groups like Vandu, folks down at Pace, we have to help build them up, and not in a paternalistic manner, but by really listening to them. And there's participatory, budgeting that's happening right now that groups like the Fund 604 Network are going through. And I'll maybe put in the chat here the budget launch for folks to check out. And in the description of that budget launch, there's the link to the form that will take you to the budget itself. I urge everyone to fill that out. We're really hoping that folks can engage with this participatory budgeting. It's reimagining what we would do with the funds if we could get them back. I really wanted to spend today trying to ground how policing is really antithetical to a liberated future for all our people, right? But I think Robbie and Karina have done an incredible job at doing just that. So it's really important that we understand how our struggles against the state include chipping away at prisons and policing, right? But if you are interested in what else is taking place, right, and who else is working on these things, you should look at some of the work that COPE is up to, I guess. They are, really pushing for reforms through the city. There's a report back from when the decriminalizing poverty and supporting community-led safety initiatives passed. The staff has come back and they're suggesting some things, but I'll tell you this: it will take some time. They're looking at a phased approach, right? First, they'll set up a panel with cops on it, and then the panel will recommend to the city what to do, and also send a submission to the Police Act. And then, all this will continue happening, and we know how bureaucracy works. A lot of you have already been involved in these sort of political engagements for quite some time, for most of your life, so you understand how slow the wheel works and moves. And that's the scary part, because in that time, people will continue to be brutalized. People will continue to be harmed, and we'll be waiting on panels. I don't want to discount the work that folks like Gene Swanson have been doing. It's been hard work, but anytime we engage with the state, instead of focusing on building up our communities and really building that dual power that we need, we get trapped in these like cyclical, I don't even know what to call it. It's kind of bullshit. Pardon my language, but we spend so much time just going back and forth and hoping for anything really. How like folks working with cops out of school will tell you, but what happened at the Vancouver School Board, it's like, a double-edged sword. You got the cops out. Oh, sure. You ended the SLO program. But as a matter of fact, what you passed is a greater opportunity for police programs in schools. That's what it's calling for. So even though you might not see cops walking around in uniforms, they're actually in the classrooms now, right? They were playing basketball with the kids, but now they're doing these, it's like to build relationships, but okay, what about the historical, nature of this institution? How does a person who is intimately familiar, with the violence that prisons and policing put on their communities, supposed to trust someone in that uniform? Defunding the police movement in Vancouver has many different places to go. There are folks that are on the fence of, are we reformist or are we abolitionist? But they're doing stuff regardless. Then there are the abolitionists, right? And then there are the abolitionists that don't know that they're abolitionists because they don't define themselves as that, but they're doing the work, right? And even people that are organizing safe walks, they're showing something to us that we require to be in community with each other to keep ourselves safe. Because the alternative is a cop on every street corner. Is that like really where we want to go? I mean, we already spent $340 million in Vancouver on cops, right? It's insane. And then it doesn't help that you've got organizations like the Vancouver Police Foundation who do charitable work for the police, right? And raise over $250,000 and help militarize them further by buying armored vehicles. For what? What's happening in Vancouver? Where do they need this armored vehicle? Do they need these vehicles to, do street sweeps? Where they're stealing, literally, they're stealing from poor people. What do they got? A shopping cart? This is property, right? This is property. So really, I think if you're doing work out there, in community, you're doing work, anti-capitalist work, if you're interested in any of this, I want to learn more, I mean, first I'd recommend, reading books by Marian Kaba or Ruth Wilson Gilmore, the OG prison abolitionist, one of them. There's a lot of information out there that will help ground your work, sure, but I think it's imperative for socialists to engage in this work, but engage in this work I hate using this word, but in an honorable way. You don't need to show up to lead or anything. You don't need to show up to really direct things, but it's showing up to understand what communities need, right? Because we're trying to build that power in those communities. They're the ones who need to be in charge of their lives, who have the answers because they've already been practicing mutual aid. They've been already practicing safety, public safety, their community safety. As an example, if folks read the Red Women Rising report from the Downtown Eastside Women's Center, Harsha Wali is one of the writers, and it will tell you, that the Downtown Eastside Women's Center were able to actually identify way many more women that had gone missing than the VPD itself. Let's think about that. 340 million? To protect who? Karina put it really well earlier. They put it really well, how through police, and not just the cops in uniform, but policing done by social workers and by institution of health, healthcare even. Like, don't even get me started on the Mental Health Act, right? That's just, through policing, they are protecting these properties, but also displacing already displaced people. First, they created the problem. Now they don't know how to deal with it. So everything goes on to the cops, right? Let them deal with everything. It doesn't make sense. We have better ways of doing things. People have already known for centuries how to live in safety with each other. We know how to deal with conflict, you know? And all of this aggravation from the state and its actors creates these larger issues that we see around the world and here, right? Gangs are, you know, a thing that we have to wrestle with. But if you think about what a gang is and how cops define gangs, you know, it's people that come together and maybe are involved in informal economies to support their communities, maybe they come from a place where you've got no opportunity. So what comes easy is what will work. And that escalates. These are results of social inequities, you know? We know this. In any case, thank you, folks. I mean, I'm feeling pretty privileged to be sitting here and having this conversation with you all. I'm looking forward to the question and answer. And thank you, Karina, and thank you, Robbie, thank you for grounding this conversation.
Thank you so much, Taz. I have a full page of notes. I appreciate, especially learning that Vancouver spends that much on police, and the police are ineffective at the things that we most often say, oh, well, we need police so that, you know, if somebody gets murdered, they can help. Well, apparently not. All right, so that concludes the speaking portion of our evening. The next portion is going to be about half an hour, 35 minutes, and we'll do questions and comments. So I have one question to all, I'll ask at the end, and then I've got some questions for each speaker. So Karina, you are the first speaker, so I will ask you the first round of questions. The questions are as follows. So Ellen asks, how would you like the situation of the homeless camps at Strathcona Camp to be handled in the future? What practical steps could be taken to realize your vision? I had a question that I didn't put in the chat, but I typed it here. And it is, what can we as average citizens of Vancouver do to help ease the struggles of the unhoused, both at, you know, maybe a low barrier level and a higher effort level? And then finally, Mark asks, thanks, Karina, great work tonight. As an RN and oh wait, that is the wrong question. Okay, well, I will get the third question. And if you want to answer those first two, I will answer the third, or I will ask the third in a second. And I think Karina is muted. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, thank you, Yvonne, for the questions and for everybody who asked one. In response to Ellen, and I think also yours in a way, Yvonne, I would say that it needs to be, there needs to be a focus on fighting anti-poor bylaws, because the city can use anti-poor bylaws in order to determine where and when unhoused people can be. And it increases the criminalization of poor people, certainly, and there can be, but ultimately, like, it's done in the interest of preserving the interests of property owners and business owners. So fighting anti-poor bylaws, like around when and where residents or like unhoused people, sorry, can pitch a tent at night, is an example of a bylaw that I'm talking about. And then I guess the other thing I wanted to add is that as socialists, we need to think of tent city spaces, not just Strathcona Park, but any tent city space as political centers. And for those of us who are organizers, that involves like building up the consciousness of the residents of that camp to see themselves as political agents who are capable of social transformation, which means challenging this notion that you have to have advocates or middle-class reformers to be the person guiding that change. And so I think ultimately that's about seeing that the politics that are about a tent city have to come from the tent city, like they have to come from the tent city struggle rather than being formed in City Hall. And I guess like I want to add in also that I have like a critique of like well-meaning like progressive reformer types who will use focus groups as a way to push in consultation whenever like city or province tries to come up with new policies that impact low-income people, because these focus groups, they don't position unhoused people, low-income people as political agents. At best, they're just an interest group among many. And the focus groups are really focused, like the priority is to just like work out the kinks in the policy. So it becomes a matter of like, not if the policy will go through, but it's a matter of how it'll go through. So it like naturalizes the policies that city comes up with and province comes up with as like as an inevitable process. Yeah, so I don't know if I answered your questions, but I hope I
No, I think you did actually. That definitely did. I've got one final question from Mark, which is, what are some success stories from around the world for providing permanent housing, especially for low income and Indigenous peoples, using socialist models?
Yeah, I really don't know too much, I'll be honest with you. But I guess I know Cuba has some examples of housing that wasn't like market, and but yeah, I mean, I don't feel confident enough to comment on that because I'm just not.
No worries at all. Sorry, I should have asked that as part of the rest of the questions as well.
That's okay. But if I can just add, like, I know Steph mentioned being a registered nurse, and I wanted to make a comment to Steph about that, if possible.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Go for it.
Thanks. I was just gonna say, Steph, like, thank you for that, because I think one way that nurses can fight for can fight against like the regulation and criminalization of unhoused people and low income folks is by fighting as a worker and fighting for your union, like the BC Hospital Employees Association, to oppose like criminalization and regulation of low-income people, and organizing against things like drug-seeking labels that a lot of low-income folks are tagged with, and which overwhelmingly is impacts like Indigenous people and poor people of color. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Karina, for your comments and for taking your time to be on this program tonight. And I guess I'll direct the next set of questions to Robbie. So for Robbie, we actually had a comment from City Councillor Jean Swanson, who says she's got a motion coming up on Wednesday on waiving the intellectual property rights for COVID vaccines and drugs. And then she's linked to that in the chat. So if you guys are interested in finding out more about that motion, go and check that out. We've got a question from Ellen. Ellen says or asks, how can we rein in the pharmaceutical companies? If we nationalize the big ones, will we have to nationalize the smaller ones as well? Is it true that AstraZeneca is a nonprofit? I've heard it has offered to distribute its vaccine at cost to poor countries. Is that an improvement? And then Stephanie says, thanks, Robbie. Great presentation. As an RN and an academic, I totally understand your comments about Big Pharma, which has a stranglehold on our tax care system as unscrupulous capitalists tax these predatory profiteers. So Robbie, do you have an answer for Ellen and some comments for Jean or Steph? Sorry, Robbie, I think you're still muted. You had it there for a second. There we go.
This is it. Okay. Well, first of all, on the AstraZeneca question, my understanding, yes, there wasn't a very highly publicized offer by AstraZeneca at the beginning of 2020 that they would provide, at least for a period of time, their vaccine at low cost or even gratis to countries that were lacking vaccines. But they reversed that decision in the summer, I think in August. And the general version of that is that it was Bill Gates that convinced them to backtrack. So, I mean, it's basically a combination of Oxford University's vaccine research team and a private pharmaceutical company. And so they are a for-profit company in principle. But unlike, I mean, at least they made the offer and put it out there that the vaccine should really be freely available. But it didn't last long. And of course, Pfizer and Moderna have never made that, and have never taken that undertaking, or any of the other companies. I think the patents now have been waived temporarily, if I'm not mistaken, by the high and mighty, despite the pharmaceutical industry's objections. How long that will last, I don't know, but it's a step forward, albeit quite late, because since the beginning of the pandemic, there are countries that could relatively easily have mass-produced vaccines if the patents were lifted. India, notably, Brazil, South Africa. And these are the countries that were lobbying for waiving the patents. Well, they finally won, but you know, after months and months and months and many deaths. So it's a shameful episode, a shameful mark on Big Pharma, and you know, that's one of the lessons that we should learn from this situation. There is a larger issue of abolishing intellectual property rights on a whole series of domains, not just pharmaceutical. I won't address that here, but it's part and parcel of the same notion that scientific and technical knowledge is the common property of the whole species and should never be subjected to private profit considerations. And that's I think that's a great cause to fight for, and will have a large resonance in the world, not just here. There's another question, but I can't remember what it was.
We actually had one question and one comment from Steph, which was saying that she, as a RN and academic, totally understands your comments about Big Pharma, which has a stranglehold on our healthcare system as unscrupulous, e.g. opioid crisis capitalists. Tax these predatory profiteers. Would you like to comment on that, or?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part?
Tax these predatory profiteers.
Yeah. Well, sure, we should tax them. along with lots of other profiteers or profit-making monopolies. But I tried to point out in my presentation that that's not the whole answer. We have to move towards expropriation at some point, and failing that, we'll never get out of the trap of a profit system that will just take back whatever gains we make on the tax front. That's my conviction, anyway. You can argue the point. I'm not saying it's it has to be demonstrated to people, but that would be my rejoinder to Oxfam and others. I'm not opposed to tax reform. It needs to be pretty. It needs to be pretty stringent, in my opinion, to warrant support. But we also have to, as socialists, we have to move beyond that and look towards definitive solutions to profit taking, not just excess profits, but I think any profit should be, we need to abolish the profit system in general. It's a long ways off. And in the meantime, we will certainly support attempts to curtail profit making.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Robbie, and thank you for taking the time to be on our webcast tonight. It was really interesting to hear from you. And okay, so our final questions are to Taz, and then I've got 2 questions to all, and by then I think we'll want to wrap up. So Taz, Mark asks, how are the defund activists working together with activists for housing, safe supply, and other intersectional issues for which the state response is to use police? Stephanie has asked, how can different socialist groups in Vancouver and the province get together to seek the abolition of police and prisons? The left must unite around this most profound struggle, and we can support reform. However, we must be very clear and articulate of our goals and values as abolitionists. So those seem related to me. And then Gary says, Engels once said that the state, in its essence, is a special bodies of armed men. In other words, the last thing the state will concede is their police forces, their violent defense of inequality and exploitation of oppression. Doesn't this make abolition a special and important demand to expose the violent core of this state to the whole working class? And all right, that's all of our questions. So if you'd like to answer some of those.
Yeah, sorry, that last comment was from Gary. Yeah, Gary,
Yeah,
you're right. Yeah, it is imperative, right, to really expose it. Well, I think like that actually answers one of the questions that I saw earlier. I think that have been already asked, but I'll answer Mark's. So how are defund activists working together with other activists? So I think one of the things you'll find is that the activist circle in Vancouver is already, as you know, small. So many of the folks involved are involved in other things, right? One of the ways in which people are supporting each other, and is something that you can probably, if you have been paying attention to, like folks that have been working around prison justice work, are folks from prison justice, right? Like they organize rallies, they organize mutual aids, they organize letter writing to prisoners, they organize fundraising, right? So it's something like that. But then on top of all that, these groups are coming together and putting on webinars, bringing on as speakers groups, people from other groups, you know, really kind of making sure that everybody in Vancouver understands that they're not alone when they're working together. So when you ask like how people are supporting Safe Supply, well, one, I think advocating is something that is like huge, right? Like everybody wants to advocate and everybody has some capacity to advocate. So that work continues on. But when it comes to raising funds, let's say, so for example, the Drug Users Liberation Front had organized a Safe Supply rally, I guess, and people came and you know, donated funds and made sure that they had raised some money, but you know, they weren't doing that alone, right? So I think you'll find that once you do start paying attention to some of the work that groups have been doing for some time. Groups like Vandu, even the Overdose Prevention Society. They're that will kind of show you how other groups are working with them, right? So for example, the Democratic Socialists of Vancouver, quite often will support the work of defunding the police that is taking place in Vancouver. That is one way groups are working together. In terms of, people that are involved with nonprofits, right? That speak to the issues of policing, like Pivot. They'll not only push for our engagement on various activist, actions taking place, like letter writing or calling or writing into the city. They'll also, work with other nonprofits and make sure that people are on the same page. So, when BCCLA sends out a toolkit to, respond to the Police Act or send in a response to the Police Act, a lot of people pay attention and do those things. So that's some of the ways that groups are working together. Of course, on the ground, the work looks quite different. I'd be hesitant to name names, but people are raising money through plant sales. They're really making sure that the word gets out. And unfortunately, like during this past year, during this pandemic, it's been much harder to do that organizing work and mutual aid work, but I think people have been doing it. So that's some of the ways folks are working together. And then, of course, like I mentioned before, you have safe walk groups that are popping up, and they're not explicitly defund the police kind of campaigns, but I think what they show is that this ability of community, and that work has also already been taking place, in places like the downtown east side, where groups like, it's unfortunate that we need it, but groups like oh my God, I'm forgetting their name, the Sweetgrass Patrol, have been needed, and this is something that was organized from the ground up, out of the Aboriginal Front Door Society, I believe. And in any case, I hope that answers that question. And then, sorry, I'm trying to find what the second question was, Yvonne. How can
you have it? The socialist groups one from Steph, yeah.
Yeah. How can different social groups in Vancouver and the province get together to seek abolition of police and prisons? Well, I think to answer that question.
Sorry, your connection was, I think, getting a bit fraught, but it seems all right now. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. Thank you. I think I would answer that question with a question of my own. How are you and how are your groups already organizing? In what way and what exactly the activities are that you undertake, right? So if you're primarily engaging with the political system in the way of not necessarily direct action, but like pushing through like reformist policies or advocating for, sorry, not advocating, but like taking actions like, calling or writing and those sorts of things. Like, how can you support? Well, I mean, look at the work that you're already doing and think of how you can already incorporate these pieces of abolition into that work. And I think agitation is an incredibly important piece of movement building in a sense. But the thing that I would recommend and actually highly suggest is that not to co-opt it, right? And not to let it get co-opted. That's the hardest part, because I think once we take on certain things, we tend to like lose control of it after a little while, especially as it spreads, right? So as you do engage, like, if you're a worker and you're unionized, oh my God, perfect opportunity, because labor is definitely not on board. And it's really scary. And it really shows the state of the unions, state of the union. Anyways, it really kind of shows, kind of the world we're living in now, how co-opted it has been. So it's important that we focus in on those channels that already exist because we're working there, right? And that's where we can potentially have some influence. Let's unite around this most profound struggle. Yeah, and like I mentioned earlier, as you engage in like reformist actions, think about how much time and energy you're spending on it as well. Because if it's going to move in a direction that's just counterproductive, first, it's going to drain you, but secondly, it's counterproductive, right? And what is counterproductive? Think about reformist reforms and think about abolitionist, reforms. Things that, like, for example, cameras, body cameras for cops, is not going to help. If we want more evidence of violence of police, we don't need body cameras for that. I don't want to see any more people dying, That's what I want to see. And that's what most people want to see, right? But I think also looking at what resources you have at hand. Do you know how to grow food? Can you grow food? Can you invest some dollars in lives of people, right? Can you donate to, Prison Justice Society? Can you show up to rallies? Can you show up to actions, direct act? Can you show up to people being evicted and stopping that eviction? Do you have that capacity? Does your group have that capacity? Organizing safe walks in your communities, but how can different socialist groups work together? The best thing, you already have it. There already exist groups that are doing this work. So if you're going to come together to support them, right? And if you want a list, maybe after this recording is over, I can send out a list of groups and social media accounts you should maybe follow, people that you should maybe be paying attention to if you need that.
That would be awesome if you could put that in the chat. I've just got 2 more questions, and we have some limited time here. So if you guys want to answer one or the other, be brief, but I will post the questions in the chat because they're both long, and then I will ask them. So these are both to all speakers. The first one is, do you see that a necessary step in the struggles you discussed is to grow and unite socialist organizations that can then better help educate and coordinate the forces necessary to win those struggles by fundamentally weakening and eventually abolishing the power of profiteers? And, Taz, a lot of your questions touched on that. And then the second one is defund and abolish the police and tax/expropriate big businesses are transitional demands that presume a transition to workers' power and revolutionary transformation. Such demands can be advanced by socialist campaigns in municipal elections and in other venues. How can we realize such a perspective unless we build a revolutionary party that fights consistently and constantly? Best wishes to all of you from Socialist Action Canada. I think this one was asked by Barry. So those 2 questions are in the chat, and if you would like to answer them, I guess let's do Karina first, and then go through Robbie and Taz, and just in the interest of time, keep your remarks brief. Excellent. All right, Karina, when you're ready.
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, yes, I think it's necessary. And it's necessary, like in context, like the downtown East Side, for instance, to build up connections and unities between different organizations that are run by residents, that have the leadership of low-income folks from the downtown East Side guiding it, because it's the only thing, like, we need institutions in order to be able to fight back against the constant disorganization of our people through bylaws and these kinds of regulatory policies on low-income folks. And so, yeah, I don't know. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina. And Robbie, if you would like to take a crack at answering these questions, please go ahead. Oh, sorry, Robbie, it looks like you're muted.
I was just going to mention that one of the models that I think has stood up historically and resulted in a certain amount of cohesion to the fight for housing rights and just generally a fight against poverty is the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. You know, established quite a reputation for itself for direct action and confronting those in power to defend the rights of the poor people, including the homeless. And there's some of that has occurred in Montreal as well, but we're a very small group in Montreal, but we hope to collaborate with other political organizations, Democratic Socialists of Montreal, and perhaps a socialist alternative group here, Alternative Socialist, to run a joint municipal campaign in which defunding the police would definitely be one of the demands that we would push for, and I think would probably be agreeable to the other groups. And we hope to involve also some community organizations. It strikes me that it's been very interesting, fascinating to hear about Vancouver. I wonder how much scope there is for liaison with other groups across the country around housing in particular, but also defunding the police, because I think there's nothing better than trying to compare situations and develop a common program, and build morale and a sense of common purpose that way. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Robbie. And Taz, if you would like to also answer these lovely questions, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, what I'll say actually is, Robbie, I think that already exists, and I would suggest that maybe if you look at folks like Robin Maynard and the work that they're doing out east, it's really a lot of that work is connecting that defunding movement across Canada and like creating toolkits and actions that could be taken. And you know, Defund 604 Network also has like a whole host of demands, but I think the answer to these questions is also you know, the same, that demands are demands, and like engaging with the state is one thing, but it's really time that we get down and get to know each other and build deeper relationships within the communities that we live in and the groups that we work with, and have the tough conversations of, you know, pod mapping. So who are your networks of safety and all that kind of jazz. So do I see a necessary step in struggles to grow and unite socialist organizations that can help to educate and coordinate the forces? Okay, yeah, sure. I think what's more important really is that we ground our work in decolonization of these lands. I'll say that is, I think, probably one of the more important pieces here, because ultimately, for socialist organizations to, you know, grow and unite, if it's not working towards decolonization of these lands, then we're definitely missing the mark, right? So I would, you know, connect with groups out here, group out east, and work together to like bring some change on the state level, but see if we can show up on the streets and for people that are doing the work on, you know, in their everyday lives, everyday acts of abolition, you know. Defund and abolish the police tax of big business, transitional demands. Yeah, sure. Again, you know, is it a transition to workers' power? What does that workers' power look like? Does it look like the Soviets? You know, does it look like something that begins in workplaces and expands out to, you know, communities and specific regions? How democratic is it? I mean, again, how decolonized it is, right? Like, is it, who are these workers? You know, what relationship do we have with Indigenous communities? So presume a transition to workers' power and revolutionary transformation, but it's not the only work, and it's not the end, I think. Yeah. So how can we realize such a perspective unless we build a revolutionary party? Dual power, where you live and where you work, where you're the most impacted by resources. So like really regionalizing it in a sense. Internationalism, of course, is important, and showing up for those. But I think the real work needs to happen here, right where you are, where you work, And really, like, that's the ideas of unions anyways, right? Like, our power is in numbers and together, and we need to be more democratic about it. So Revolutionary Party, sure, but make sure it's driven by ideas of direct democracy to a certain extent, and it doesn't just end up becoming the next NDP.
Excellent. Thank you, Taz. All right, everybody. Well, that is the last question of the evening. We are just coming up to 8:30. So I just wanted to say thank you guys all so much for coming. It was very interesting to hear from all of our panelists on these topics that I wasn't expecting to be as interrelated as they turned out to be. The similarities between a lot of the drives and actions and obviously causes were quite fascinating. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Socialist Unity Assembly, you can come and check out our next assembly. It is going to be June 6th, 2021. So it's the first Sunday of every month we have this assembly. So if you're interested in hearing more about these topics or collaborating with other socialist groups on solutions for these topics, please come out and join us. Thank you guys again. This is the end of the seminar, so it was great. And have a great night, everybody. Take care. Oh, and sorry, one more thing. Big thanks to Joe for lending us the Zoom account and doing all the behind the scenes work on, muting, unmuting, allowing people in and stuff. So thank you so much, Joe. Okay, bye everybody.
Thanks, Joe, and nice to meet you, Taz and Karina.
Yeah, likewise, Robbie. Nice to meet you as well, Karina. Way to go, all the work you're doing down there. It's incredible.
Thanks you two for speaking. Hopefully we'll meet in person one day. Thanks everyone for coming.
Okay, and on.